between the Third World Network, Friends of the Earth International, Forest and Finance, Rainforest Action Network, as CBD, as NGO caucus, and Sahabat Alam Malaysia. And then the other caucuses we have the pleasure to invite, or to work together with rather, the CBD Women's Caucus, Gibbon, Global Youth Biodiversity Network, and of course, very importantly, the Indigenous International Forum on Biodiversity. So welcome everybody. And yeah, in this side event, we look at some different aspects of biodiversity, offsetting, of financialization, and of innovative finance approaches. As first speaker, I want to introduce Mirna Ines Fernandez Pradel. She works with the Third World Network as a researcher and has quite some years of experience in international negotiations, but has also worked on the ground with communities in Latin America. And she has seen over the years how innovative financial approaches actually have been recycled a few times. So Mirna, can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Thank you so much, Nele. I will try to give you through a short walk through some innovative finance approaches for biodiversity and why we say that we are recycling failures. Actually, we used to say that some financing approaches that we are seeing are like zombie narratives because we managed to kill them and somehow they managed to come back in a different shape and with different definitions, but in the end, they are the same thing that we have seen failing again and again. So we see this, I will go to the first slide, on the target 19 on resource mobilization. That is such an important target and is the main thing that we are discussing in this SBI 7. There is a sub-target, target 19D, that talks about what they call innovative financing approaches, such as payment for ecosystem services, green bonds, and biodiversity offsets and credits. These are all financing approaches that, even though they call them innovative, they have been there in the scene for many years already. And we have seen them failing again and again. And I will show how they have been failing and why we must question ourselves first if they are really innovative, and second, if it makes sense to focus on these kind of approaches when we are talking about resource mobilization for biodiversity. We can go to the next slide. So payment for ecosystem services. It exists since when? It is there since already the 1990s, when they started being part of the Costa Rica National Program. They have human rights risks because they have proven to end on exclusion of indigenous peoples, especially when they don't have formal land titles. They cause a elite capture and unequal payment distribution for communities on the ground. We saw examples on restriction on the access to the forest, to the water, to the grazing areas, and there were weak consultation methods, especially when they came to implement free, prior, and informed consent. We see that payments can and have commodified culturally or spiritually important relationships with nature. And also they have risk for ecosystem integrity. Because they have low additionality, the payments, it is possible that they reward conservation that would have happened anyway. It is very rare that these payments would go for an ecosystem that is highly threatened by the oil industry or the mining industry, for example. The leakage, which means that damaging activities are not eliminated totally, but they are translocated to another area, but they are happening anyway. There is weak permanence because when the payment stops, the evidence suggests that the results also stop, so they don't last in time. And we also have poor targeting. It is high in transaction. We are being recorded. We have unclear tenure and inadequate monitoring. So since this is all based on payment, when the payment stops, we don't have more monitoring. We don't know if the results are going to be there forever. And the payments usually are for short cycles, like 10 years of monitoring. And we know that no tree is going to grow in 10 years. So this is why, in the end, we have many projects of payment of ecosystem services that after some years, you have nothing on the ground because the results are not visible anymore. We can go to the next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the next mechanism that we talk about, it's about the green bonds. Is the last slide, please. Yes, thank you. So they exist in 2007. So we're talking about almost 20 years already that they exist. And they were first addressed in the climate awareness bond that was from the World Bank that coined the term green bond for the first time in 2008. They have similar risks related to human rights than the payment of ecosystem services regarding displacement of indigenous peoples and local communities, but we also have land acquisition and labor abuses, reduces access to resources, and other risks for indigenous peoples and communities on the ground. They have weak safeguards and weak consultation mechanisms, and the supports can still have serious human rights implications. And we also have similar problems with ecosystem integrity, but we also have the addition on the potential of greenwashing and weak taxonomies on the eligibility criteria. I will go to the next slide, biodiversity, offsets, and credits. And I will just say that these mechanisms are the oldest among these three. They exist since the 70s in the US with the US wetland mitigation strategy and the species banking in Australia that also started in the 80s. It's a long time that we have seen these mechanisms didn't work in almost any ecosystem, only on very simple ecosystems like a lake that is translocated from a place to another place for a construction of a building, something like that can be. But the rest on complex ecosystems like forests or coral reefs, we have no proof that these ecosystems can be lost and replaced elsewhere, and the whole characteristics of the ecosystems can be replicated because restoration science is very new. So we have all the failures with additionality, the leakage, the permanence, and mainly the failure regarding ecosystem integrity is that we cannot simplify all these complex relationships in the ecosystems and put them into tradable metrics. We will zoom in the next slide, please. So we have been studying and trying to understand how these mechanisms work, and we find them highly ineffective and harmful because they are flawed on a top-down, they are based on a flawed and top-down conservation model that has high costs and it is highly ineffective. It is repeating the same failures for the carbon markets, and it has a lot of concerns for equity and justice because it keeps benefiting the elites and the corporations, but it displaces the communities and marginalizes the people on the ground. It can lead to greenwashing, and it offers unstable revenues for the governments and the communities that are implicated in these mechanisms, and they have nothing to do with the real solutions on the ground that I will talk about later. We can go to the next slide. So I want to explain a bit more about the logic of carbon and biodiversity markets, because this is quite important. Both the carbon and biodiversity offsets and credits follow a logic that is inspired on the logic of the economic markets. So if I have a company and I spend some money, so I have an outgoing money, but then I get some money extra, then I can put the money that I gained plus minus the money that I lost, and I have a net revenue that is positive, right? So this makes sense when we talk about money, because we have money coming, money going, and in the end you make a sum and a rest, and in the end you have a net positive outcome or a net negative outcome. But they tried to extrapolate this into carbon. And with carbon, it makes sense, at least because we're talking about the same units that are gigatons of carbon. So they say, okay, if the company emits certain amount of gigatons of carbon, but you have carbon sinks like forests, then you can say, okay, I am absorbing this carbon, and in the end you have a net zero because what is emitted is trying to be absorbed. It makes sense with the unit, but it doesn't make sense in a time logic because the carbon is emitted in minutes, and the time that it needs to be sequestered can take years and hundreds of years. And also we don't have enough land to offset. We would need like 5 planets to be able to absorb all the carbon that we are emitting. With biodiversity, we have even a more complicated logic because we're not talking about a unit like carbon gigatons. We're talking about the whole ecosystem that should be somehow translated into a unit of biodiversity that we can offset somehow. So let's say a mining company destroys a portion of the Amazon, and we are going to restore a forest somewhere else, probably even in another continent. And the counting can be, for example, in hectares. So we lost 50 hectares of forest in the Amazon, but we are restoring 60 hectares of forest somewhere else in Africa. And in the end, minus 50 plus 60, we have a positive of 10 hectares. So we say this is nature positive or net positive. So this is why it doesn't make sense, because it is highly ineffective. We cannot translate all the complexity of nature and an offset to compensate it somewhere else, even not if it is in the same ecosystem or in the same region, because the species and the relationships and the cultural values and the significance that it had for the communities that depend on this ecosystem is not going to be replaced if you restore it somewhere else. Can we go to the next slide? And for this, there is a whole discussion on safeguards, because when you have the language of the Target 19, it says we will follow these mechanisms with environmental and social safeguards. That is something that we have been advocating for. And there is a whole discussion on safeguards on this, in UNEA, in many other processes that say, okay, we're going to address all these problems with safeguards. But so far, none of the safeguards of the Rio Conventions have worked, and the safeguards that were implemented in the CBD have not worked either, because they rely heavily on self-monitoring and self-reporting, and they are voluntary in nature. So it is highly difficult to have effective safeguards if they are based on the same institutions contracting the same consultants for the same institution to address their effectiveness. So if we have a financing institution, for example, the World Bank, to have a team that is going to address how they are implementing the safeguard and report on how they are doing in the implementation of the safeguards, the reports will all say yes, 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 all green. And that is what we have seen, for example, in the study of the CBD on the implementation of safeguards in biodiversity financing mechanisms. That is something that was seen in the previous SBI. And it was based on a self-assessment survey for biodiversity finance institutions. And it was basically a questionnaire, like, are you implementing free, prior, and informed consent? Are you engaging the communities effectively? Are you sure you're not destroying the environment where you're implementing these mechanisms? And they say, yes, 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 yes. And all, if you see the table, is a green, 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 green table, because they are assessing themselves. And that is the problem with implementation of safeguards. Also, they are not binding. And a very good friend of us, Simon Lovera, used to say non-binding safeguards are a contradiction by themselves, because if they are not binding, they are not safeguards. But no, all of these safeguards are voluntary in nature. And that is why these safeguards touch on the right aspects, like ecosystem integrity, human rights, rights of nature, traditional knowledge, but the way in which they are implemented makes them ineffective. I will go to the last slide. How should real safeguards look like? That is a lot of text. I'm sorry for that. So I will summarize what we have here. First, states should establish common safeguards, and they should be regulated by the states, not by the companies and not by the implementing financial institutions. They should be binding in nature. They should require due diligence before approval. They should define the ecological integrity through measurable and like-for-like outcomes, so not replacing ecosystems with other kinds of ecosystems. They should be verified through independent experts, so no contracting consultants that are linked and paid by the same company or financial institution that is implementing the safeguards. Affected people must have accessible, independent, and time-bound grievance mechanisms. It is really important for people and indigenous communities on the ground. And we should prevent conflicts of interest, speculation, and misleading claims. And we have seen a lot of these in the implementation of carbon credits. The conflicts of interest, the same certification agency is the same that is receiving the money and the same that is evaluating themselves. So this should not happen. This is my last slide. I will go to the last one, please. So the real question here is, why should we invest more time and resources and our time on these discussions on these measures, on these mechanisms that have shown that they fail? and they have failed for so many decades already, while there are real and effective solutions that we should be discussing right now. And this, I know that my other colleagues will go deeper into this, because these are solutions that are being implemented by stakeholders, indigenous peoples, women, youth, and they promote the recognition of the human rights, the rights to land, the effective regulation of companies that should be providing the resources that we're looking for with these kind of mechanisms, the removal of harmful government subsidies. If we remove harmful subsidies and dedicate this funding to do conservation for biodiversity, we would not be even needing biodiversity or carbon markets, because we would have the money already. We're talking about trillions of money. And biodiversity offsets and credits are doing, like, I don't know, maybe 20 million. It's like between millions and trillions, the question. and supporting a just transition towards food systems and agroecology that ensure that the funds flow directly to the communities on the ground that are making the real change. I know my fellow colleagues will expand on this, but if you want to know more about our analysis, you can go to the next slide. On the thank you slide, we have our website, and we have a lot of materials about it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mirna. That is quite a history of financial mechanisms that we have seen and that have created difficulties in the past. So it's very important to make lessons learned from that. But there's other questions related to the market-based approaches and what are the links with that. But before I go into that and I give the word to Hector, I would want to briefly present to you something that has been made by colleagues from the Rainforest Action Network, who have produced a guide with all the different birds who have a certain song related. It's of course metaphor, but the songs which are related to financialization and financial mechanisms, etc. And what is this song? Where can you recognize it when it is being sung here in the CBD negotiations? And you can, with that guide, also see some of the critical questions. So maybe it would be good, if you're interested, if you don't have one yet, you can come here after the side event and come and get a copy. Another thing I want to make a little promotion of is this comic book, which is made by colleagues from the Green Finance Observatory. They have made, it's Frederick Eicher in reality, who has made a huge comic explaining in easy terms something that is quite difficult to understand because it is made difficult, but he explains in the comic to his grandmother what this all is about. So it's quite beautiful drawings. Come and get a copy after the side event if you're interested. So with all of this, we can now go to Heitor de Laste, who is from the policy advisor from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. And he will talk about what we are giving up when we are relying on market-based approaches to finance. So please, Heitor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nelly, and thank you everyone joining us today. My approach will be complementary to Mirna's one. And the idea is the same understanding about the reliance on market-based finance and the overcoming of more and more narratives being pushed in the CBD space on the need for increase to enhance private market and market-based approaches. So since for target 19, we have many different sub-targets, and two of them I pointed for blended finance and other for innovative financial mechanism. And when you go for the agenda items for SBI, both resource mobilization and all the ads, you can easily understand that there is a trend on considering pushing for private finance much more from the other different types of approaches. So the idea is really to think what we are giving up, and what we are giving up specifically when we are considering biodiversity and people's outcomes. So next slide. So the first thing is the discussions around the billions to trillions narrative. That is the narrative that has been held by the World Bank for a while and has been going to many other spaces. That is the idea that while public capital is limited, and we are in a moment where public capital is shrinking, because the expenses are being allocated to other areas as military and war expenditures, we still have a really huge opportunity to rely on private capital. And we should use on this narrative public capital actually to upscale private capital, to de-risk private capital. But we do have some evidence already that this narrative is not being showcased in reality. This is not being translated in reality. So from 2023 studies, and this study is actually focused on blended finance for SDGs, but is also touching and giving us illustrative examples on thinking on blended finance also to biodiversity space. The first thing is how much blended finance is allocated for sustainable development. And while we compare these numbers, we only have a very minor figure of $50 billion per year being allocated when we need to compare with many, many other demands for biodiversity. When you think about what a blended finance structure means, and you have different types of blended finance structures, but usually they are just the combination between public and private capital, and public capital using for de-risking, for scaling up, or other related activities to ensure that private capital have the opportunity to be invested in different projects or sectors. Actually, 73% of the total of these blended finance mechanisms, they are coming from public financial sources, and only 27% is genuinely private, which means that when we are talking about biodiversity finance, at blended finance, at the end of the day, we are still talking about the importance and the reliance on public capital as critical for any sustainable development goal. And finance, who blended finance is reaching is the other question. And blended finance is not reaching those countries or those territories that are the most needed when you're talking about biodiversity demands. So most of the blended finance, they are focusing and only going through middle income countries, to bankable sectors, or to large investors, rather than to mega biodiversity countries and to people who are implementing projects on the ground. So this is just this shows us and illustrates this persistent shortcoming in mobilizing resources at the scale and the pace that is required for our social and environmental outcomes. Next slide, please. Next slide is a further discussions on green bonds and blue bonds that are also mentioned, is one prior to that. And what is exactly this? So thematic bonds, they are basically use of procedures instruments, which means that you need to have a specific standards or taxonomies that define to you what are the sectors and activities that you can invest. And then the issuer of the bond, they will raise funds and allocate these funds to specific designated and agreed projects and sectors, and later on, they will need to present the transparency of how these resources have been allocated. But the point here is, how do we define these standards and these taxonomies, and what they are able to capture when we think about specific biodiversity outcomes? They are also not up to the challenge that we have, and they are not up to the challenge to fund the biodiversity main activities that are protecting our ecosystems. So most of these standards and taxonomies, they are not able to capture local-led or conservation projects, particularly those who are difficult to standardize or to measure. So if you identify some of these, I think the audio or other. Okay. We are back. Nope. Oh, yes.
It's somebody else on there. Yeah.
Is it your phone?
Hello.
Hello? Yes, okay. So, yeah, so coming back, the idea was a bit of the discussions on the bond structures. And just remember, again, bond structure demands a use of proceeds, so you can only use the resources that are raised to finance specific activities or sector that was predefined. But here the question is, what have been defined? How things are defined? And what we have understanding when we really go on more in-depth analysis, both at international standards, but also to national taxonomies. And these national taxonomies also lack inclusive participatory approach, or the understanding that biodiversity action also rely on the work from communities on the ground, from small scale activities. And also the fact that for most of these bonds to be scaled up, you need bankable, what they call bankable solutions. So you need projects that are able to be invested. And these projects always rely on activities that are harm also to biodiversity. So what we have so far is that most capital that are being issued on behalf of under the label of green bonds or blue bonds, they are actually targeting energy, transport, and building, and water and waste management sectors, rather than all different types of activities as small scale restoration, steward of indigenous lands, governance, and other related aspects. And even when you have some bonds issued that are going to these activities, they are sovereignty bonds, which means that there are still countries that are issuing bonds to raise resources for different activities, and then they are potentially including activities who have less reliance on economic return. So this is the second evidence that environmental criteria, or the idea of use of proceeds, they are not automatically interpreted as evidence to finance on environmental additionality. So even when you have results that are showing that green bonds or blue bonds are raising new and additional financial resources, the point is for what, and if this necessarily creates the evidence that this is going for finance and environment, which the answer is no. And the other aspect that I will touch less upon, because I think Mirna already unpacked it enough, is biodiversity offsets and credits. And very quickly, I think the definition of the biodiversity credit is complex by itself, because this is the intent to represent, measure, and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome. And when you try to unpack a little bit of these concepts, it raises you a lot of different questions, and you understand that this is not something still possible or accurate to be translated. So one is this lack of science-based methodologies that are able to capture the different and the complexity of nature itself. And also how to deal with this complexity when we need to learn from many challenges and conflicts arising from previous experience on market, on carbon market and offsets as well. So baselines, additionality, permanence, the risk of leakage going to some other places. These are all problems that get additional layers of complexity when you realize that biodiversity have many others metrics. And in addition, these metrics are also shaped by diverse values of nature, which needs to incorporate the different relationships that people and territories have with nature and how they relate with nature itself. So the question that we usually in the next slide try to raise here is what biodiversity finance needs and what biodiversity finance needs to reach. And just very briefly, 2 slides, the ICCA consortium, the Territories of Life, have showcased us that biodiversity relies in the steward of indigenous peoples and local communities worldwide, based on traditional knowledge and cultural practices and many other relationships with nature. And the next slide is also showing us that civil society movements have been playing a really critical role in advancing biodiversity conservation. And most of the civil society movements globally, they are concentrated in areas that are highly important for conservation, showing that there is an overlapping between high biodiversity conservation areas and social movements pushing for transformation and fighting for environmental justice. So when we call for, and the next slide, please, right-based approach to biodiversity finance, what we really want to think is that is the fact that halting and reversing biodiversity loss do not require necessarily more finance, but this required a shift in social and environmental outcomes shaped by financial instruments and financial institutions, the transformation of financial instruments and financial institutions. The next slide, please. So the idea is close the biodiversity finance gap in a right way and with rights. So it's not about raising additional financial resources, but is think how can we really understand what do we need to do to mobilize financial resources and who needs to be reached from biodiversity finance. So what biodiversity needs is funding that is shifting from destructive activities, harmful subsidies, for example, that are not up to the challenge and we are not bringing as we should in the discussions in this space, but also moving for territories and peoples who are stewarding. So there are many different layers for us to think on a right-based finance approach, and unfortunately not unpacking them this, but potentially at some other point. But there is the right to development, which is tracking the discussions around the imbalances and power imbalances between global north and global south countries and high-income people and the poorest in the worldwide. So it means that international finance commitments needs to be up to the challenge. We should still ensure that development assistance and the resources flowing from developed to developing countries is also about repairing historical inequalities. Debt sustainability, debt reform, debt justice is also ensuring that we already know domestic finance is the crucial and the most relevant aspect nowadays for biodiversity finance. So open space and fiscal space for countries advance is extremely relevant, and basic incomes for people to ensure also their good quality of life. So rights to self-determination, which of course targets reads to most of our discussions on a direct access to right holders, groups, including indigenous peoples, local communities, but also women and youth, and strengthening territorial governance, understanding that those who are stewarding biodiversity are also those who need to be supported. And of course, the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment that is thinking on the transition away from harmful subsidies and incentives and using these resources to be reallocated for sectors and people on the ground. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aitor. On all of these reflections on the link between offsetting and finance, I think there's one further reflection which I would quite like people to just think about. If we are looking at biodiversity offsetting as a source of finance, and if this is restoration offsetting, because otherwise we're actually locking in the baselines of destruction. So I cannot believe in any way in a kind of offsetting that is based on preserving existing ecosystems. The one with restoration, that could be certain logic, but even, and we have heard the difficulties with it, but even from a financial perspective, there's also the question that restoring is a lot more expensive than conserving. So when you look at it in an overall macro perspective, maybe for specific actors in specific moments, they can get some gains out of it. But in an overall perspective, we cannot possibly believe that having offsetting as a source of finance. At best, it is actually a payment for compensation, but mostly it will be more payment than what would be needed to have the conservation. And I think this is something that needs to be researched a lot more, and that needs to be taken into account by countries who are hoping to receive funds from biodiversity offsetting, as it is in Target 19. Anyway, I just wanted to add this brief reflection, but I don't want to stop too long with this. I just want to pass the word now to Amelia, who would be bringing a feminist perspective to this current debate on financialization of nature, and maybe think about how it might help us think differently about the role of finance in addressing the biodiversity crisis, specifically from a feminist perspective, because Amelia is the coordinator of the Women's Caucus, so I'm sure she will have a lot to tell about this. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you so much. And I'll be actually building in what has been already shared a bit. If we can go to the first slide. Can you hear me here? Perfect. Because maybe I will invite you to, can you hear me? Yes, great. Okay, so the first thing that I want to, for us to reflect together, it's to give a bit, maybe one step back in terms of about conventional economics and how they are building into in two main pillars that are largely invisible to this market-based economy. And one is the social reproduction activities, and the other is the ecological reproduction, right? So the productive market economy, as we know, and from that is where the financialization comes as a next step, relies, and it's built on the paid labor, on recognized social labor that many people around the world, particularly women or feminized beings, are delivering every day, for centuries. So this economic market, the market economy, is building on that activities that sustain our households, sustain our communities, that sustain our societies. And at the same time, this same economy, it's building on the invisible, let's say, contributions of nature to people, as the CBD likes to name it, but it's about all the inputs that we have the opportunity to rely on from biodiversity. I don't want to call them services, I don't want to call them products, I don't want to call them maybe the contributions. Huh? So these both invisible foundations of the market economy have now entered the debate, have now entered into the realization of the economic accounting. But that is how they have entered the formula is a bit of the problem for us, is that we want the recognition and not necessarily the commodification of those social relationships, and not the commodification of the contributions of nature. And that is the problem when it comes to financialization, because that is a bit of next step. Like nature and care and labor, like the care relationships are now visible, now are being price tagged, like they are now being given a particular cost. They are, as my colleagues have been sharing, they are now being, there's an intention to try to make them into measurable units, trying to give them into particular price, turn them into assets, and then make them investable. So a bit of the problem is, first off, that we are still not considering the whole big picture about the invisible, the invisible foundations of the economy, and then the complication of trying to these relationships that come from a different value system, trying to box them into an economic value, like a capitalist values, and try to make them attractive for private and capitalist dynamics. So for us, the problem is, if we can go to the next slide, is not the problem, sorry, what we are proposing is actually changing the question. It's not how do we make biodiversity profitable enough for finance, for the financial sector and actors to be interested in investing in including and developing all of these innovative mechanisms. For us, the problem is even one step behind. Like, we don't want to make biodiversity profitable for finance. We want to rearrange the economic and the financial system to be compatible with the reproduction of life. And that means to invest in the social reproduction and the ecological dynamics, not because they're going to give us a return, but because that is what sustains everybody's life, like the whole planet. So the proposal, and by making this inversion in the question, maybe and it's a big ask, is how can we make biodiversity destruction economically impossible? And I think that is slightly addressed in targets 14, 15, right? When we are trying to regulate or try to shape how the economic activities could be non-so destructive to biodiversity. But at the same time, like, what we make these activities economically inviable or impossible, how do we make care and restoration and regeneration of life the priority? How can we make that attractive? But at the same time, in my mind is like, do we really want to make that attractive? Like, what is there the solution? Because it's not that they have to be attractive to the finance, but more about how finance has to comply with and contribute to the sustaining of life. So the proposal, if we go to the next slide, we have different ideas at the macro and the micro level, territorial level, that build also as well in the analysis that you have heard from my colleagues. No, the first one definitely is the regulation. Like what I was saying, like at national but also at international level, certain activities have to be made inviable or illegal even. And we have that, no? Like it's certain regulations that we have in many of our countries. The problem that we have seen is the matter of the enforcing. And we know that many countries are really allergic to that word and to that action. So, but that is the proposal. Like, we have to start at the regulation level to make these activities to identify that activities as the no-go. Then the redirection of economy, target 18, like the identification, the repurposing of subsidies, harmful subsidies, but rather investing in the stuff that Aitor was already mentioning about public expenditure, public development banks, central banks, financial regulators, and all of this. No, like, how do we rearrange the activities and even the productive matrix at the national level? How can we deprioritize activities like mining, extraction? Yeah, big ideas, I know, and I see some faces like, yeah, this sounds good, but how do we do it? But, well, that's the question for all of us. How can we advance this? I'm just saying this is the proposal. Let's find ways of doing it. Because then here for the matter of redirection, the problem is not about what are we producing, but what actually if we even have to produce that much and those particular things. No? The redistribution, it's also something that people have been mentioning, and at the moment it's in the impediments thing, and we hope that it stays there, and that in terms of policy, the redistribution is about we challenge this narrative, again, with the narratives and the birds, we challenge the narrative that there is a finance gap. Like, money is there. So there's no money gap. It's the matter about how do we distribute the money that is in the world, and in what are we using it. And it's about progressive taxation, no? The debt cancellation, like you all can find that information in these nice publications from my colleagues. And particular, one idea that I want to drop here is that there cannot be care economy or regenerative economy if there's no fiscal space. And it's about rearranging how can the countries from wherever they are, because even sometimes the global north also has certain complications with their own policies in-house. So definitely everybody, like all the countries, have to reorient their policies. And the last idea here is the redefined value, and comes to the question I was posing, is like, what are we measuring as the success? What is what we are counting as we made it, and this is what we want to prioritize, and this is what we want to invest on. So it's not about how much resources we are making flow. No, when it comes to the financial mechanism on its own, how we are evaluating the success of the financial mechanism is not about the amount of dollars that are flowing, but the outcomes that are coming out from the use of those resources. And I have 0 minutes, so maybe we can just go to the last slide about the territorial proposal, just to mention that is obviously related to the advocacy points that we have here, is about direct resources to the people already sustaining ecosystems, financing ecological labor and care, not to make them a commodification, but to ensure that there are economic resources for the activities that require economic resources to continue, but also to finance the social conditions that make conservation use possible. Here, particularly, I'm referring to make possible that women particularly engage in conservation in terms of time, in terms of having this, not being in survival mode, but actually having the possibilities and the opportunities, that's target 23, the opportunities and the conditions to contribute. So finance the social conditions that they can continue to do what they are doing, which is not work in terms of conservation work, but their contributions to the whole planet, and redistribute power, not just the money. I won't be able to unpack all of this, but that is the proposal. As in, maybe what we have to do is not even try to answer the question about how do we make biodiversity attractive to finance, but rather how we reorient economic and finance towards life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amelia. And I now want to present Ramson Karmushu, who is from the My Indigenous Knowledge in Action, MIKIA Kenya, which is part of the IIFB. And Ramson will speak about some examples of communities in Kenya who have been implementing the KMGBF and from before and after, how things are evolving. So please, Ramson.
Thank you very much. And yeah, good afternoon. I think we have had quite a lot of examples from the global level, and I think maybe it's good to also come at the national level and different projects that have been implemented in the country before and after, and how people are learning and trying to change, and how these are all affecting communities in different ways. And yeah, I think from the KMGBF point of view and the biodiversity finance itself, I think it's always a call and clear that, we have had in so many reports that almost 70% of biodiversity finance come from payment for ecosystem services and all these kind of credits, according to also the talks that we have had here in these discussions around here. So it's also something that I think quite a lot of people are looking at the private sector and philanthropy in all these discussions. So that also brings us to a question. Is there really money that we're talking about something? That is there money in this section of payment for ecosystem services, carbon bonds and all that? And I think the answer is clear. Yes, there is money, there is funds, there's financial resources. And the question is, how is this funding reaching the ground? And what's the impact of it? I think that's the question. Because if there is money, then how it's monitored, how, like, what safeguards are there, how communities are benefiting, how are they affecting communities and all that. So when we all try to look at it and what's the motive, of all this, what's the primary goal? I think they have a purpose, different. I mean, when I try to look at Kenya, the Kenyan case is try to conserve environment and to try to make sure that those environments remain like natural, as natural as possible, and as well as like to improve it. That's the main driver, to try and prevent like population encroachment and all that. Like we have seen quite a number of examples, like the corridors of wildlife movements where communities are paid to maintain those corridors and not to use them. And then we also try to look at a little bit, because there are quite a number of communities benefiting in different ways, whether in good ways or bad ways. But of course, they are benefiting good money or less money. And a number of them are, we have like the carbon credits that we have benefited, I think, quite a number of communities in northern Kenya, like 36 of them that are supplied by, for example, the Northern Rangeland Trust, and which has been there for quite some time. And we also have like Sagau Wildlife Corridor, the Red Plus projects, and all that. And I think, doing all that, we can mention quite a number of things that are there. But where is the funding come from and through who? I think the whole system is private, probably, if I may say. So it's coming private to private until the last bit that reaches communities. And I think when we try to look at taking our own example in Northern Kenya and Ilingwesi itself, and a number of other communities, we always questioned it because the way, for example, carbon sinks is measured, how different communities are benefiting, it's not really clear. It's not clear in a number of ways. One, for example, we have a lot of communities, like I mentioned, that 6 of them, but getting a blanket and giving communities the same amount of money, I don't think that's right, because different communities must have been doing different things in their own landscape. And of course, maybe some communities are doing conservation in a better way than others. So there is no clear way of how this is measured and how communities are getting this amount of money and not different from the other one. So it has always been a question, like, why are we receiving the same amount of money with this other adjacent community? And we believe that we are doing a very good work in terms of conserving and rehabilitating nature than the next community. Their lands can also be different in terms of size, in terms of like what plants and animals are there and things like that. But of course, you could also see what is also being used. No communities are being engaged. I think what is used a lot, and there's a research we are running trying to identify. They're using what is used is Earth observatory satellites or drones to run over their lands and all that, which also have a question like, do they have a right to just run a drone over our land? What do they collect? How do they use it? And things like that. So there are quite a number of things that we also are asking ourselves, and I think communities are now coming on board. But we also have some communities that are doing a good job in terms of transect monitoring of their biodiversity increase in areas. But that data, again, is not going anywhere. And I think this also goes beyond just communities, because they might not have that capacity to link and talk with any financier who is giving these credits to communities. And that's how the near private sector is just manipulating community in many ways. And yeah, I think I mentioned quite a number of examples, but today there are quite a number of growing examples now that are coming. Before we had something like payment for ecosystem services. I mean, like green bonds, like solar energy and all that. But today, I think there is a little bit of innovation where communities are now drawn into payment for ecosystem services. And yesterday, I think we went into one of the communities, and where we are seeing farmers are receiving some kind of funds to maintain an ecosystem in such a way. But now this is more focusing on trying to maintain those lands and making sure that communities are incentivized to remain in that kind of land, being conserved and things like that. But it's also a question that we ask ourselves. For example, in some communities, mostly in southern Kenya, where people have their own land, you're paid something like 70,000 Kenya shillings to leave your land open and not to use it for anything. But you try to imagine of a father with 10 sons, and this piece of land is going to be subdivided to the 10. So is that really sustainable in the way that the 10 sons will be getting $700 per month? You can imagine it's like $100 per month. And how will that continue to incentivize those guys like to stay in that project? So we of course foresee something like going beyond that and just deny the project. And then the other thing is community equity. In some areas, like in northern Kenya, where we stay in community land, there is no clear way of access and benefit sharing when it comes to how these resources are distributed. And I think this is something that we see, like the management boards are completely like just manipulating communities and do projects that they feel like this is what is needed. So there is nothing like free, prior, and informed consent in terms of what do we do with the money we are receiving. Again, it's a little bit of control, like you're given money, but you also control, like this is how you use it. This amount of money goes to rangers. This amount of money go to development. This amount of money go to the, but you're not given money and told like to do it in a different way. There is one organization that has recently approached our community, and they want to give each and every person money, which is like $50 per person. It could be a good amount of money, but there is always a question. Who are you receiving money from? What is the percentage? What are we receiving and for what? Like, they're just like, when I just approach you and I tell you like I'm giving you $50 and together with your whole family, you'll of course ask yourself all these questions. But that's something that we are seeing. Of course, there are quite a number of improvements maybe, but again, like there's still questions that are not answered. You are not engaged, the process not very clear. I'll stop there. I know people might have a lot of questions.
Thank you very much, Ramson. And thank you to all the speakers. And I would now like to give the floor to anybody who has any question to our speakers. So the floor is open. Yes.
Yes, thank you all, the presenters. My name is Titta Lassila with the Swedish delegation and working for the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. I really appreciated all the presentations, and most of it is familiar to most of us. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to perhaps the Third World Network specifically, but even the rest of the speakers, your views, as we've heard even here during SBI, we've had some side events with the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. We know about the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, International Institute for Environment and Development is also working on community monitoring and developing methodology for biodiversity credits. So I would say that this offsetting credits, we do have a quite broad consensus that we don't want to go there. We should absolutely not offset. So I see that there is a consensus. So I would like to ask your views on the different approaches that are at least stating that they are trying to do things differently and not offsetting, doing everything the way that the Third World Network was also explaining. We also in terms of carbon market, we in Sweden, we have an organization, We Agroforestry, that is working in Kenya and elsewhere in African countries. And we're financing a carbon expert desk. And they're working with the AFOLU sector on within the carbon credit market. So if you're familiar with that, I would like to hear also. your views on their work. Then my other issue is more difficult because like how do you have any concrete? We already heard we cannot probably have the answers, but when we don't really have time to wait until we have a different global economic system in place, but we somehow need to manage within this space that we live in. So what would be like concrete actions that we as states who are major donors and want to partner broadly, and as Sweden we are committed to rights-based approaches, how to do this considering all the elements that were presented, that there are easy ways to direct money on energy, on infrastructure, but would it be like localization? Now we're talking a lot about subnational and local governments, like localizing action, localizing private partnerships, or what would you suggest? Thank you. Sorry for talking for a long time.
Thank you very much for the question. I propose we gather a few questions and we then give a round for answers to the speakers. I have seen Edna.
Thank you, but mine is not a question. I might come back later. I just want to praise the presenters, and I hope that this information permeates farther than this room, because it's exactly what we need to be negotiating in SBI.
Okay, thank you very much for the support. We have another question. Yes, please present yourself and then your question.
Yes, my name is Laura and I work with Indigenous peoples worldwide fighting against green colonialism. First of all, I wanted to say thank you so much for all the insights. Today is, everyone might know, International Day of Indigenous Peoples. So it was very interesting to hear about all of this. First of all, it was very, very refreshing to hear that public finance is going towards military and war. And it's very interesting also to have these committers of these wars here invited to talk about biodiversity negotiations while they are the first one committing ecocides. And one of the other points that I really liked was the concept of the same organization and companies that are implementing these whole solutions are the same, that are committing human rights abuses, and are the same that are not respecting international law, are the same that are asked to control the mechanism of grievances, of redress, of monitoring, etc. So I found that controversy so clear, but also like, why are we still talking about this? Regarding one of the points that was mentioned before about one of the questions from Sweden, it was strange for me to hear about Sweden being committed to right-based approach of conservation while they're committing green colonialism to the Sami indigenous communities in their own land. So that was, for me, a little bit strange. And regarding Northern Rangeland Trust NRT, is very interesting to hear you talking about how these money come with conditions, right? So yes, there are some money that arrives to the communities, but for what and to what level, the manipulation that is there, free, private, informed consent is not respected. Who are you receiving this money from? And this is one of the main points that I think it arrived, but not a lot in the conversation, is we know what these mechanisms are. We know to whom they are imposed on, but why are they there in the first place? To continue having these governments and corporates to basically continue to pollute. And what last point is the feminist perspective. And one of the offsetting that was not mentioned is population offsetting, which was actually a big thing pushed also by WWF, a way of basically offsetting carbon footprints through project of family planning and contraception projects in the Global South. So imposing basically women in the Global South to not have babies. And this was very, very much pushed by WWF, which is part of a group pushing for women's rights. And the other trend that is happening is the feminization of militarized conservation. Yeah, that's it, feminization of militarized conservation. So the point is to using local women to present militarization as more gender affirming while it is just militarization.
Thank you very much. Is there any further question? Yes, please. And after that, we'll make a round of...
Hola, buenas tardes con todos. Yeah, I'm Antonio Sanchez from Peru. Yes, I have a question about biocredits. Okay, you don't agree with biocredits or biocredits using as an offset? That's a simple question.
Very good question and very concrete. Thank you for being so concrete. Okay, we shall just give a quick round of responses, maybe in the same order as people have spoken, to just keep it simple. Mirna, please.
Thank you so much. I think I will address the first question because well, with Laura's comments, I just agree and I am thankful for the comments, which are very true. And on the question from our colleague from the Swedish delegation, that addresses, for example, the distinction between offsetting biodiversity offsets and credits, and mechanisms like the Biodiversity Credit Alliance and the International Panel for Biodiversity Credits, that if they are not aimed for offsetting, we don't think that any of these mechanisms ensures that they won't be used for offsetting. I think that the IIPB has gone the farthest, saying that compensation will be only at the local level and like for like, which is not the worst that could happen, but the fact that would be local compensation still means offsetting because it is compensation for damage. But it has gone the farthest, at least. On the BCA, we don't really exclude, we don't see a guarantee for exclusion of offsetting on the principles of the BCA Alliance. And I understand that the EU nature credit market is still under development. We hope that the EU nature markets are going to be probably stricter on the definition of how these nature credits are going to happen. If they don't allow for compensation and are only credits aiming for financing nature conservation or restoration, that is something that we would like to see. But so far, we didn't see any mechanism that ensures that this won't be used as permits for destroy. And that is what has happened in the implementation of biodiversity offsets and credits so far. We see a lot of high integrity principles or other voluntary standards, but these are what they are voluntary. So we don't see any binding instruments that ensure that there will be a complete exclusion of red lines or no-go for offsetting for damages in highly ecologically important areas or areas that are have cultural importance, or all these things that we're worried about. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think first for, sorry that forgot the name, from Swiss, Antonio. Just compliment, I agree with Mirna, and of course the point on our analysis that there is no credible use for biodiversity credits outside offsetting, and this is the major problem here. So most of the cases in most of the standards, when they are pushing for biodiversity credits, the reading is pushing for offsetting. All other tentatives to use biodiversity credits, they already exist and are already covered by other financial instruments, which means that we don't think that is the case to create any different or any additional financial instruments. So for example, using biodiversity off credits to support or enhance ecosystem services. You already have payment for ecosystem services. You can improve it. You can make it more accessible. You can and combine payment for ecosystem services with companies' dependencies and so on. So there is no a need for create a biodiversity credit, and the only reason that we have been analyzing is for pushing for biodiversity offset, and this is the very damaged and complicated situation. And Swiss also asked a bit, Sweden, sorry. Sweden also asked, and sorry again, don't remember your name if you, but sorry. No, so immediate action for sure is very complex. Institutions are old, institutions are old-fashioned, so that's why many of our narratives are really pushing for transformation and pushing for transformation from the bottom up. But for sure, like as a funder, there are many ways for you to connect better and to improve dialogues in decision-making process with right holders groups. So I think there all this bureaucracy or all different financial challenges regarding canalizing resources to the grounds are things that can be improved, and given more trusted-based finance, that those who already steward biodiversity are also those who know how to use financial resources for biodiversity. And Laura, just thank you for many unspoken things said for you.
I will perhaps try to tackle the concrete ideas within the economic system that we live. First off, it's the public expenditure, and that thing reaches as well about in what we are investing the money that is all of our money, and we are not doing it in activities that is related to care, restoration, agroecology, sustainable food systems. Not like we are investing public money in things that are destroying biodiversity. So I think that is concrete. Like we have the money, let's invest in activities that sustain life. The point about financial regulators, central banks, like how again the public actors can make difficult or not give credit at all for activities that are destroying biodiversity. Again, it's something concrete that within this system can be done if there is willingness, like not to invest in mining, in the agro-industry and so on. The matter about debt, cancellation of debt, something concrete. Tackling tax avoidance, the reform, the trade rules, so countries cannot, don't have to continue be invested in extractive models. The matter about international tax cooperation, like avoid this international tax avoidance, illicit financial flows, that can be within this. Actually, those are actions thought within the capitalist system, and maybe a bit more concrete is about direct access, which direct means direct, doesn't mean intermediaries, doesn't mean either friends or allies or whatever. Direct means direct to the women, to the IPLCs, to the youth. Care economy, like the public, this is at national level, invest in income security, invest in land rights, in community infrastructure, in activities that allow women to have free time. And yeah, definitely agree that it is this push for certain indicators, activities that seem as empowering women is actually against the basis of and the values that we're trying to promote. It's not about militarizing. It's not about dictating women what to do with their bodies in terms of transforming the consumption patterns. It's more that global North has to be responsible of their own impacts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will try to be brief, but when we talk about like the mechanisms that came after COP15, I think we have always questioned how the involvement or the engagement or the participation of Indigenous peoples are. And I think, yeah, I was one of the people who I actually engaged, but I refused to engage in the process because it was not clear. I am an individual and I am not Indigenous peoples. And it became very hard for me to engage, for example, with the BCA and relay back the information to the whole, the 7 sociocultural regions, which I will be representing. So there was no clear engagement because I think it would have been like engaging, yes, us, but they would give us time to back forth, bring the information or share the information with the larger groups we represent. And I think if we are clear as Indigenous peoples, then we should step out of that project, because it's not bringing us to close relationship to who we really are. And we also directed, we tried as much as possible to push that they engage existing bodies that have, for example, funding or give funding for Indigenous peoples to share this information to their own caucuses and bring back the results. We know the business sector is always fast running, but of course, for us, we are slow because we want to understand processes. And that was a very big challenge for us. And for those who engage, because there are still Indigenous peoples who continue to engage in the process, they have their own interest where they want to tap resources and bring to their own communities in a good way or in a bad way. And then number two is about the broad consensus. And I think this is now where we also ask ourselves, when you talk about biodiversity bonds, we always say that biodiversity is how you look at things. But when you come to Indigenous people's lands and territories, I think we look at biodiversity being a very diverse topic. And, that's where we get our food from. That's where we call hospital. That's our spiritual place. So we cannot just give it a value. But we need to sit down and really discuss how can we, for example, measure how probably we can give through, if it's my pasture land, I can count in terms of how much grass I get in this land and how many animals can it feed, so that you see a little bit of a value of one component. But it's my insurance also when it comes to hospital and hubs and things like that. But lastly, when we talk about everything, rights are important. We have seen quite a number of projects that came, for example, the wind project and all that, which disowned communities their land and have a company having a land title and disowning the landowners who have been using that land. I don't think that's really right. And I think there's still so many things that can be revisited in terms of how to do all these things.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the four speakers. And yeah, I think it's really through all of this, it becomes clear that we cannot rely on making nature valuable in order for it to be preserved. And it should be the other way around. States should make the resources available, and there are means for doing so. Redirecting perverse incentives is a very important way. It is in the target 18. Another way, which I just briefly want to mention, is linking up with the negotiations right now that's ongoing for the tax convention, which would really redistribute how fiscal flows go in the world and make sure that there's no tax invasion, and then maybe resources can become free, so we can support Indigenous peoples, local communities, those who support biodiversity on the ground, not in terms of, oh, you need to prove that you are economically contributing, etc., but really because of the value, the intrinsic value of life itself, and being supported by public systems. That will be completely different model, but it is possible in the current settings with implementing targets 18 and with working with the tax convention. There will be a lot more reforms needed to be done, but these are important first steps. So thank you very much, everybody. And yeah, I'll hereby close the side event. Who wanted, whoever is interested in the publications, we still have some available.